Let us turn in our Bibles to the Gospel of Mark and chapter 4. The Gospel of Mark and chapter 4. According to AI, and that's supreme authority in all matters these days, according to AI, the most common conversation starter amongst British people is the weather. The weather. Have you ever noticed that? Have those of you who have come here from other parts of the world, have you discovered that? That we British people, we just love talking about the weather. And 9 times out of 10, we're talking about the weather in order to complain about the weather. It's either too wet or too dry, although that's the rare one. It's either too hot or it's too cold. And although I wouldn't want to try and excuse our constant complaining, perhaps the reason we talk so much about the weather is due to the fact that it is so unpredictable in this part of the world. Some of you come from countries that have 4 distinct seasons, and you know with a reasonable degree of confidence what the weather is going to be like in spring, what it's going to be like in summer, what it's going to be like in autumn, what it's going to be like in the winter, and you know with a reasonable degree of confidence what it's going to be like for a day. And so you wake up in the morning, you look out at the window, and you can be fairly confident what the weather is going to be like for the rest of that day. And that's why people in other parts of the world have 4 distinct sections to their wardrobe, each containing clothes suitable for a particular season. Whereas in Wales, we wear the same clothes all the year round, something that's waterproof and reasonably warm. We do so because you never know how or when the weather's going to change. You can start the day with glorious sunshine. By lunchtime it's blowing a gale, and by evening it's pouring with rain. And that's how unpredictable the weather can be here. And from what we read in our second scripture reading, it seems that we are not the only place on the planet that gets unpredictable weather. Other places do as well. At least that is what Jesus and his disciples discovered one day. And we are going to look at that occasion recorded for us at the close of chapter 4. And the first thing we see as we do so is we see a Jesus who needed sleep. A Jesus who needed sleep. Now, if you glance back to the start of chapter 4, you'll see that this chapter begins with Jesus teaching the people by the side of a lake. The lake that is referred to is Lake Galilee, sometimes called the Sea of Galilee, because it was quite a sizable lake. And on this occasion, there's so many people who have gathered around to hear what Jesus has to say, that he's had to get into a little boat, he's had to move out from the water's edge, and he's had to teach the people from the boat. It was like a floating pulpit. That's how big the crowd was on that occasion. But by the time you get to verse 9, you discover that most of the people have left and Jesus is now alone with his 12 disciples. But that didn't mean that his teaching had stopped for the day. No, he continued to teach his disciples throughout the remainder of that day, explaining to them the parable of the sower that he's just taught. He then went on to explain the parable of the growing seed, the parable of the mustard seed, and so on. From what we are told in this chapter, it seems that it was a full day of teaching. And as those of you who have done some teaching, either in schools or in university, as those of you who have done some teaching will know, a full day's teaching can be an extremely tiring day. And so it shouldn't come as too much of a surprise to read in verse 38 of Jesus being fast asleep at the end of that day. But did you notice where he was sleeping? He hasn't gone to the nearest Premier Inn for a kip. No, He's fast asleep in the stern or the back of a boat. Not a boat that was just a little bit out from the edge, but a boat that was way out in the middle of the lake. And how did he come to be there? Well, when evening came, after that long day's teaching, Jesus, we are told in verse 35, said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." That is the other side of the lake. And so leaving the crowd, the people behind, his disciples took him in the boat and they started out across the Sea of Galilee. And would you believe it, verse 37 tells us that a furious squall came up and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Lake Galilee is the largest freshwater lake in Israel, and it is quite unusual because of its elevation. At a level of more than 200 meters below sea level, if you can picture that, sea level, and this lake is 200 meters below that, at a level of 200 meters below sea level, it's one of the lowest lying lakes in the world. And because of that, and the surrounding landscape, the conditions on the lake could change suddenly. And that is precisely what has happened on this occasion. Since leaving the shore, the weather has taken a dramatic turn for the worst, and the boat is now caught up in a serious storm. And yet, in spite of the wild weather, Jesus is fast asleep in the back of the boat. And what does that tell us about Jesus? Well, it not only suggests that he was a sound sleeper, and it not only confirms that he's had a long, hard day teaching, it also demonstrates that he was truly human. Like the rest of us, this Jesus was tired after a long day's work, so much more so that he's able to sleep through the turbulence of the storm. And this is not the only occasion when Jesus demonstrates such human characteristics. In John chapter 4, we read of Jesus traveling from Judea to Galilee in the north, and at some point during that journey, we read that being tired from the journey. You and I get tired when we go on a journey. Jesus, being tired from the journey, sat down and took a rest at Jacob's well as he stood by the grave of a close friend. What would you do in that situation? When he stood by the grave of a close friend, he too wept. And as he hung upon the cross, he cried out, "I am thirsty." You see, the Jesus who was born in Bethlehem, and the Jesus who walked the streets of Nazareth, and the Jesus who died on a cross outside of Jerusalem was a real human being who had real human needs like you and me. He knew what it was to be tired. He knew what it was to be hungry. He knew what it was to be bereaved. He wasn't an angel who merely had a human appearance. And neither was he some kind of Superman whose humanity bore little resemblance whatsoever to ours. No, he shared our humanity. That is what the Bible says. Not our fallen, sinful humanity with all its deceit and its wickedness, but he did nevertheless share our humanity. And in doing so, he experienced the limitations of our humanity. That is why the historical Jesus was a Jesus who got tired, as this incident in Mark chapter 4 demonstrates. What you see here is a real man, a real Jesus, who needed sleep. The second thing you see is a Jesus who calmed a storm. A Jesus who calmed a storm. Now, if we're going to appreciate the seriousness of this storm on Lake Galilee, then it's worth remembering that several of the men who are with Jesus on this occasion, several of these men were experienced fishermen. If you can think back to the men that he called to be his disciples, some of them were called from mending their nets at the side of the lake. So some of them were experienced fishermen, and experienced fishermen on this very lake. And that perhaps explains why there seems to have been no problem in acquiring the use of a boat, either at the start of the chapter for Jesus to preach from, or in verse 36 to cross the lake. It may very well have been one of their boats that was used on both occasions. And yet what we read in verse 38 is that these men, some of them are hardened, experienced fishermen. These men are beginning to panic, and understandably so. In spite of their many years' experience on this very lake, these men are quickly come to the conclusion that this might very well be their last time on this lake, for the simple reason that it's beginning to look as if it could be the day when their boat goes down and they're lost at sea. In view of the fact that the waves are breaking over the boat, verse 37, it's getting swamped, these men are beginning to think that their number may very well be up. And so it's not surprising that they're a little bit taken aback by the fact that Jesus is sleeping through it all, as if he didn't care one bit about their future, of their fate. And so in their fear and frustration, they wake him up with these words, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown? Don't you care?" Verse 39 tells us that Jesus got up and started to bail out the water from the boat like the rest of the men were doing. Well, I suspect that is the sort of help they wanted Jesus to give, and that is the sort of contribution they expected him to make when they woke him up. But that is not what happened. Jesus didn't wake up and merely become an extra pair of hands to bail out water. No. Verse 39 tells us that he got up and he rebuked the wind and he said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Now, I suspect that there have been times when we all wish that we could change the weather conditions. So, for example, have you ever made plans to go to the beach or to go a walk in the mountains the next day, only to discover on waking up that it's pouring a rain and it's blowing a gale and therefore unsuitable to do what you planned to do? And in your disappointment and your frustration, you stand at the front door or you look out the window and you think to yourself, "Oh no, if only it would stop raining and brighten up. If only." Have you ever tried shouting at the rain and shouting at the wind and telling them to stop? Have you ever tried that? You try it the next time. And in reply, you're probably thinking to yourself, "Come on, David. Don't be so ridiculous. Why would we do that? The wind and the rain can't hear what we say, and even if they could, they're not going to listen to us, are they?" And the answer is no. They're not going to listen to you, that's for sure. Due to advances in technology, the Met Office can tell us several days in advance that a storm is coming. But what the Met Office, or anybody else for that matter, cannot do is stop the storm from coming. Have you noticed that? They can tell us to take precautions. They can issue a red weather warning. They can tell us only to travel if absolutely necessary. And if it's going to be really bad, they might even tell you to board up the front of your windows and all the rest of it. They can tell you all the precautions to take. But the one thing they cannot do is stop the storm from coming. No amount of technology can control the weather. Have you noticed that? We've made huge advances in technology. I quoted AI at the beginning of the sermon. A couple of years ago, that was unthinkable. We can put men on the moon, and we're about to do it again. We can send buggies to Mars and all the rest of it. But we cannot tell the wind and the rain to stop. But do you realize that 2,000 years ago, there was a man on this earth who could? Do you realize that? He could. Verse 39 tells us that when he stood up and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still," the wind died down and it was completely calm. What we see in this incident is not only a Jesus who needed sleep, but also a Jesus, the same Jesus. We see him calming a raging storm, which raises a question this morning. And this is my third point. So who then is this Jesus? Who then is this Jesus? Now, in view of how bad the conditions were that day, it's probably no surprise to read of these men being afraid. I'm sure you and I would have been a little bit afraid if we had been in that boat. But what does perhaps come as a surprise is to read in verse 41 of them still being terrified. Because verse 41, please note, is after the wind has died down and the sea is like a mill pond. And so in view of the fact that the storm is over, you would have thought that all the reasons for fear had now vanished, would you not? But not so. Even after the storm has passed, they are still terrified. The difference is they're now terrified for a different reason. Whereas before they were terrified because of the storm, now they are terrified because someone has demonstrated a power and an authority that they have never seen before. Someone has demonstrated a power and an authority over the forces of nature. Someone has demonstrated a power and an authority over the storm, and so they're terrified because they are now left wondering, here, hang on a minute. Who on earth can this possibly be that we've got in the boat with us? Or to quote them exactly in verse 41, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. It's quite something. They were terrified. But being Jewish men, those disciples may have been familiar with the Old Testament scriptures to some extent. And if they were, then there was something written down there in their Old Testament scriptures which would have helped answer their question. Do you remember what we read in our first scripture reading from Psalm 107? It's a psalm which provides us with a record of the various ways in which people down throughout history have known God's intervention in their experience. If you remember it, and you can go back later and read it, because if you remember it, it was a record of how people in different situations, desperate situations, cried out to God for help, and God in his goodness and grace responded to them. And here is what it says in verse 23 of the psalm. Others went out on the sea in ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunken men. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. Listen to what the psalmist says. He, that is God, stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. Does that sound remotely familiar to you this morning? It sounds very similar to what those men experienced in Mark chapter 4, does it not? Those words were written hundreds of years before this incident on Lake Galilee, and what the psalmist was saying way back then is that it is God who controls the forces of nature. It is God. It is God. It is the Lord. If you've got an English Bible, it is the Lord, capital letters, i.e. it is Yahweh, the eternal God, who has the power and the authority that is required to both create a storm and then to calm the storm. It is God who can do that. It is God and God alone who can still the storm to a whisper and hush the waves of the sea. No mortal, no mere mortal can do that. No president or prime minister. You know, our world leaders think they've got enormous power, enormous authority. They can give the word and this happens and that happens and this flies there and that flies there and everybody else flies nowhere. They can give the word and that's what happens. But no president or prime minister can do this. But, says the psalmist, the eternal God can. It is the Creator, please note, it is the Creator who has authority over his creation. Which raises the question, who then is this man that's in the boat on Lake Galilee? Who is he that even the winds and the waves obey him? Last week we discovered from the healing of the paralyzed man in Mark chapter 2 that you cannot come to the conclusion that the Jesus of history was just a good example or just a good teacher. You cannot come to those conclusions about Jesus. That incident in chapter 2 forces us to conclude that he's either the liar and the blasphemer that he was accused of being, or else he is the divine person that he claimed to be. And if you're still not sure which of those two conclusions to come to this morning concerning this Jesus, then can I encourage you to think seriously about this incident recorded at the close of chapter 4. I say that because this incident on Lake Galilee demonstrates that this Jesus was and is much more than a religious teacher or moral example. This incident demonstrates that at the same time as he is truly human, as we've seen, at the same time as he is truly human, he is truly God. Being a man, a real man, he was tired and went to sleep in the back of the boat, verse 38. And being God, he stands up in verse 39 and tells the wind and the waves what to do. This incident demonstrates that Jesus is both God and man. Or as Christians throughout history have described him, he is the God-man. And it's vitally important that we come to that correct understanding of who Jesus is, because until we do so, we will not trust him as we should. That's what the experience of these men on the lake demonstrates. Prior to them asking their question, who is this? Did you notice the question that Jesus asked them in verse 40? He says, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Now, although their earlier concerns were in one sense understandable, their response to the storm demonstrated that they weren't trusting in Jesus as they should. That is why Jesus questions their lack of faith in verse 40. And the reason they weren't trusting Jesus as they should was because they hadn't realized who he was. Oh yes, they address him as teacher in verse 38, but they never addressed him as creator. For the simple reason they failed to realize that he was God. And if only they had realized that he was the divine creator of this world, then that would have given them the confidence that this Jesus had authority over his creation. You see, what this incident on the lake demonstrates is that in the person of Jesus Christ, the creator of this world has stepped into his creation. And that is great news for you and me this morning. Because if anyone is going to be able to sort out the mess this world is in, then surely it is the one who created it in the first place, is it not? You do realize, of course, that this world is not how it was originally created to be. I hope you appreciate that. It was originally created to be a beautiful and a pleasant and a perfect and a perfectly safe place to live in. But following man's rebellion against his creator, this world was cursed. Cursed by God. And that is why it doesn't always function as it was originally designed to do. That's why life in this world can often be a difficult and a painful ordeal. That's why our experience of life in this world can often be a dangerous one, as this incident on Lake Galilee demonstrates. It is our rebellion towards our Creator that has made the entire creation, including us as its creatures, it is our rebellion that has made it to be marred and blighted and ruined by sin. And can I just say that the effects of our sin upon our own lives and upon this world, the effects of our sin are so big and so bad that no politician or political party has the power or the authority or the ability to deal with our problems. No amount of ballistic missiles will rectify the problems of this world. Yes, you can remove a bad man from power, but the chances are you'll just replace him with another bad man. Our world is in such a mess. And just in case you watch the news and you pinpoint the finger at everybody else and what they're doing wrong, I hope you realise that our world is in such a mess and we are all contributing to that mess. And therefore, if it's ever going to be sorted out, then what is needed is from someone outside of our world to step into our world and to deal with the root cause of our problems. And did you know that is precisely what God has done in the person of his Son, Jesus Christ? Rather than allowing this world to carry on relentlessly in its rebellion and suffer the consequences of doing so, God has stepped into our history in the person of Jesus Christ. The Creator has stepped into his creation. That is what you see revealed in the calming of the storm on Lake Galilee, because don't forget, it is only the Creator who could exercise such control over the creation. And so what you see there in the boat, what you see visibly demonstrated there on Lake Galilee, is that the Creator has come into his creation. It demonstrates what Paul says about Jesus in Colossians 1 verse 16, for by him, that is Jesus, for by him all things were made. He is the Creator. And that is why he's able to demonstrate such authority over the creation. And having stepped into his creation, he not only demonstrated his power and authority over the creation on Lake Galilee, but he later did something even more amazing. He later made his way to a cross outside Jerusalem and suffered the curse, the divine curse, which has characterized our lives as rebellious sinners in this sin-cursed world. In his death, Jesus voluntarily took that curse upon himself. And as a result of him doing so, do you know the great news this morning? As a result of him doing so, this sin-blighted, sin-cursed creation will one day be liberated from its bondage to decay, as Paul tells us in Romans 8, and be brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God. There is a glorious future for this sin-cursed creation. And that is in a new, redeemed, restored creation. And the great news for you and I is that all those who put their trust in him, this Jesus, all those who put their trust in him are not only rescued from the frightening eternity of judgment which their sins deserved, they also have the glorious prospect of spending eternity in that new and redeemed creation, a creation that will be entirely free from the curse and the sin and the effects of sin that we currently see all around us. That is the glorious future that awaits all who turn from their sin and trust in this Jesus. But don't forget, if the experience of these men on the lake demonstrates, we will only trust in Jesus as we should if we've come to understand who he truly is. And for that reason, can I encourage you to seriously think this morning about the question those men asked following the calming of this storm on Lake Galilee? We'll only trust him as we should when we come to appreciate who he truly is. And so for that reason, please think seriously about the question these men are asking. Who is this that even the winds and the waves obey him? Three things we see from this incident at the close of Mark chapter 4. We see a Jesus who needed sleep, demonstrating the true and full humanity of Jesus Christ. We've seen a Jesus who calmed a storm, demonstrating the full and true deity of Jesus Christ. And so you need to go away and think, so who then is this Jesus?